This podcast is brought to you by Most Valuable Podcasts, leading the league in podcasting entertainment.
What's up, Real MVPs, Ricky Widmer here, and of course, you guys know it, I'm all by myself, back for another primetime podcast, and before I get into the whole spiel of what I'm talking about today and what to promote before each segment, I gotta apologize to you guys, because ever since the Brandon leaving the primetime podcast, me moving in kind of this home studio so I don't have to always travel to the studio that we kind of use for the MVP normal podcast, been a little bit inconsistent with the recordings of these primetime podcasts, looking to get more into that schedule starting this week, so coming back the normal usual time for the primetime podcast was right now on Tuesday, so I just want to get that out of the way. I'm sorry to you guys who expect me and kind of come to us for the college football coverage and the draft coverage that we provide here on the Primetime Podcast, but got a jam-packed show. Going to be looking at the Wisconsin Badgers loss to my Fighting Illini. What up? Did I expect them to win? No, I didn't expect them to win at all. When Sean told me the score, I thought it was 40-7, because that's usually what happens to Illinois. But we finally got a win, our biggest win since 2007 when we beat Ohio State. I'm going to talk about that, what it means for the Big Ten race, kind of the race in the West and the East, and then also what it means for the college football playoff, because that's going to shake things up in the college football playoff. Also going to take a look at Joe Burrow and his draft stock. Is he all hype? Is he for real? Could he be a top 5 pick? I'm going to go ahead and take a look at that, especially with how the Tua injury might also fit into that. And then last but not least, I'm taking a look at the Atlanta Falcons. Last time I did a primetime podcast, took a look at the Miami Dolphins, and you guys seem to like that. So I'm going to take a look at the Falcons. Right now, they would be, I think, a top 3 pick. I think it's the Bengals, the Dolphins, the Falcons, the Redskins, and then the Jets after tonight's loss to the Patriots. I'm recording this during the fourth quarter, and the Jets are going to lose. No way they're going to come back and win that one. So I'm going to take a look at the Falcons and which prospects they could look at if they end up with a top 5 pick at the end of the year. Before I get into everything, though, make sure to check us out on Patreon, patreon.com/mostvaluablepodcast. That is how you help support the channel. Make sure that we can do things better for you guys, coming at you with weekly podcasts. You can join our Discord server, Discord server for as low as $1. You can suggest topics and ask your questions to the podcast for us to answer at the $5 tier. And then the $10 tier, that is where you come on the podcast with us and we talk about what you would like to talk about. But let's get into the Wisconsin loss. And like I said, my Fighting Illini getting the win. Did I expect them to do it? Hell no. I expected us to get steamrolled by Wisconsin, but I am happy that my Fighting Illini get the win against the Wisconsin Badgers. And this kind of a loss for Wisconsin shakes things up, not just in the college football race or the college football playoff race, but it shakes things up in the Big Ten right now, because right now, as I'm looking at the standings in the East, it's kind of a 2-team race right now. You got Ohio State undefeated, you got Penn State undefeated, Michigan losing to Penn State is now a 2-loss team. They're pretty much out of it at this point. And then in the West, this kind of makes things a little bit more interesting because Wisconsin already has a loss. They're going to have some interesting games coming up on their schedule. But not only that, you have Iowa, who's a 2-loss team in the conference right now. They now, hey, with Wisconsin losing, hey, maybe if we beat Wisconsin, we get our hat back into the ring for this Big Ten title. And then, of course, you have Minnesota, who to me is surprisingly at 7-0, undefeated in the conference at 4-0, but I'm going to get into them in a second, where really in the East, this doesn't impact the East too much in my mind, because the East is going to come down to Ohio State and Penn State, and even if, let's say, this weekend, because Ohio State and Wisconsin play each other. Let's say Wisconsin goes into Columbus, goes into the Horseshoe, and upsets the Buckeyes. Even if the Buckeyes lose that game, the Buckeyes could just beat the Penn State Nittany Lions on November 23rd, and boom, all is forgiven. They'll have one loss. Of course, they'd have to beat Michigan and Rutgers and Maryland to do that. They would only need that one loss to beat Wisconsin. But really, I see that Penn State-Ohio State game being the game that decides it between the two East opponents. This loss, though, shakes up the West in the Big Ten so much because the remaining schedule for the Badgers right now, this weekend, I already mentioned it, they go into Ohio State. The 26th of October, they will be in Ohio State, the undefeated Buckeyes playing right after they lost to Illinois. I'll be completely honest. I'm not buying the Badgers in this one. I'm betting the Buckeyes. So I'm thinking the Buckeyes are going to win this game. Badgers, I'll be honest, with this loss, I think the season's kind of over for them because I don't think they're going to beat Ohio State. Iowa, they could still win. I know because it's a home game. I think that one is still a close game, but the Badgers could come out with it. And honestly, I am not buying the Minnesota Golden Gophers. I'm going to get into their schedule when I get to them, but I think with this Illinois loss, the Wisconsin Badgers are done because really the only loss that I had for them on their schedule in the preseason, if they were going to win the West, was this Ohio State game. And now they're probably going to have two losses. And, Minnesota, even let's say they beat Minnesota, if Minnesota goes undefeated until that very last game, that's November 30th, that those two teams play, if Minnesota goes into that game undefeated, it's going to be not a mattering or not a big game because Wisconsin will have two losses in the conference if the Buckeyes do get it done. I know I'm talking like that game has happened already, but I see no chance. The Buckeyes are on such a roll that I think the only team that has a chance to beat them in the Big Ten is Penn State. I know Penn State looked really good against Michigan, and I know what you're saying, Ricky. It's a Harbaugh team. Michigan looking bad, Penn State looking good. I think Penn State's the only team in this conference that has a chance to beat Ohio State. I think they will be the ones to probably come out of the Big Ten, and it's probably going to be undefeated. Then you look at Minnesota, that team that right now is at the top of the Big Ten. And I look at them, and I'm going to be completely honest. I ain't buying the Golden Gophers. And the reason why, their wins right now, I'm just going to list them off in case you're like, Ricky, I haven't been watching much Minnesota football. Let me know who they've played. Well, they won by 7 points to South Dakota State. Really tough opponent there. Then they went on the road to Fresno State. It took double overtime, and they won 38-35. Yet again, real tough opponent there. Tougher than South Dakota State, but a really tough opponent there. Then Georgia Southern, they won 35-32. Again, real tough opponent. I'm loving this tough schedule from the Golden Gophers. Then they played Purdue, 38-31. Big Ten games, I'm not really going to get into schedule. We all know the West is weaker than the East. We're going to move on from that. Then they play Illinois. They thrashed Illinois 40-17. That one was in Minnesota. Then they played Nebraska, yet again, at home in Minnesota. Beat them 34-7. And then they played Rutgers this past week. On the road, they won 42-7. My point being, and I know Minnesota fans, the beginning when I was talking about your non-conference schedule, I was going to turn you off there. And I apologize for that, but really I don't, because to me the biggest criticism I have for Minnesota is who have you played? You haven't played anybody. Purdue hasn't been that good this year. Illinois has been trash except for this win against Wisconsin. And really, I'm looking at it, and the only reason we pretty much beat Wisconsin in my mind is this was the type of team, the Wisconsin team, how they're built. This was the one offense that Lovey's defense is built to beat. So it put us into a good situation. Now, I know the players had to make the plays, and they ended up doing it, and that's part of the battle as well. But I mean, really, We're not, just because we beat Wisconsin, we're not a world beater type of team. Rutgers, not a good football team. Like they've always been bottom of the Big Ten. And then Nebraska, they're probably your toughest opponent, I would say, that you've had on your schedule so far. But if you look at the schedule coming up for Minnesota, this next week, it's still another easy one. Expect them to go 8-0. And you know what? I'm going to say it's not that easy. I'm going to backtrack that comment. I expect them to go 8-0. But who knows? The team that they play in Maryland could come out and upset them. That could be a loss, but I think the Golden Gophers will still win. Then it gets tough from there because you've got to go, yes, it's at home, but you're playing Penn State. I don't think Minnesota wins that game. I have the Nittany Lions winning that one on November 9th? God, November 9th is going to be a good weekend in college football. I got Penn State winning that one. Then they have to go on the road to Iowa City to play the Iowa Hawkeyes. That's going to be a tough game because you're playing on the road. Then you got Northwestern, which could go either way, but sure, I'll give it to Minnesota because you guys have played better this year. And then you end the year November 30th against that Wisconsin team. Yes, it's in Minnesota, which helps you out. But I look at it and I just, to myself, I think, number one, season's going to come down in my mind to that Wisconsin-Minnesota game. And I don't think Minnesota is going to be the team to come out of it because in order for Minnesota to do that, they would have to run the table until the Wisconsin game, and I don't have them winning against Penn State. And if they lose against the Iowa Hawkeyes, in my mind, they're out because I don't have them beating Wisconsin as well. So that's why I'm not really in on the Gophers. Now, you may be saying, Ricky, what does that mean for Wisconsin then? If Wisconsin can get back into the Big Ten title game, I'll get there in a second. Patience, young Padawans. I got to talk about one team first, Iowa. Their remaining schedule, Northwestern, should be a win for the Hawkeyes. Then they go into Madison. That's going to be a tough one, like I mentioned, with the Wisconsin side. That's going to be a tough game. Since it's in Madison, you'd like to edge the needle a little bit towards the Wisconsin Badgers because up until this past week, they've looked like the better team. Then they play Minnesota. Then they have Illinois, which I guess anything can happen, but let's be honest, Illinois was playing at home. It was homecoming week. There were a lot of things that tilted into the side of this upset if you really do think about it. And then they've got Nebraska. So for me, I think that Iowa's going to be out. They're going to probably lose to Wisconsin. They'll beat Minnesota, but they'll have too many losses in conference. Here's the way I see the Big Ten playing out with this loss, and that's going to kind of bring us into the college football playoff side of this. And the way I see it in the East, it's going to come down Penn State, Ohio State. If you put a gun to my head, I'm going to say Ohio State wins the East. On the other side, I think that right now, if I had to say it, Iowa loses to Wisconsin, which writes them off. They have 3 losses in conference. They're not going to make the Big Ten title game with 3 losses. Wisconsin, I think, can win out the rest of their... I won't say win out. They're going to lose to... They could lose to Ohio State, win out from there, which would put them at 2 conference losses. Then you've got Minnesota. I think they lose to Penn State. That's 1. And I think they lose to Wisconsin, and that's 2, which would put them the same amount of losses as Wisconsin, but it would let Wisconsin into that Big Ten title game. So how I see the Big Ten rolling out, Wisconsin, you're probably looking for like, Ricky, what's our playoff hopes? They're dead. Unless you guys win out, they're dead. Because if you lose to Ohio State this weekend, you ain't getting into the playoffs with 2 losses. I'm sorry. So in my mind, I could see a 2-loss Wisconsin team winning the West, getting into the Big Ten title game, getting a rematch with the Ohio State Buckeyes. And then from there, it's what does that game mean? That one game mean for the playoff? Well, if Ohio State wins, goes undefeated, they're probably in the playoff. Otherwise, if Wisconsin, a 2-loss Wisconsin team, beats Ohio State, then that means the Big Ten's probably not being represented in the college football playoff. Because let's move over into that last part to kind of end this and put a kibosh on it. I'll give the top 7. So, no, the top 6. The 4 that would be in the playoff right now. I know they're not college football playoff rankings. It's just the AP top 25. I'll give the top 6 because that'll be the 4 in, the 2 out. And then I'll kind of give my thoughts moving forward. Number 1, obviously, Alabama. Number 2, LSU. They stay the same. Clemson and Ohio State flipped this week. Ohio State's 3rd. Clemson is 4th. So if the playoffs were to start today, if we use this, Clemson would play Alabama. Ohio State would play LSU. Then the 2 teams to kind of just be out of it, you've got Oklahoma at 5, Penn State at 6. Let me talk about the teams that are out of it. Penn State, once they lose to Ohio State, they're out of the running. Then you look at Clemson, then you look at Oklahoma in my mind, and Oklahoma, if you look at their schedule, they should win out. However, look at the strength of their schedule in my mind. That's going to be something that I think that plays into it because, I mean, their best win, in my opinion, has been Texas. But Texas, they, to me, have been kind of, although they have 2 losses, and one's against LSU, that looks like a really good loss, and then Oklahoma is a good loss as well. This is a team that West Virginia took them to the brink. Les Miles in Kansas almost beat them this weekend. So all Texas needs is one bad loss, and that's bad on Oklahoma. Oklahoma the rest of the way, the Thundercats of Kansas State. I know they're Wildcats, I like calling them the Thundercats. Their only ranked opponent right now is ISU, Iowa State, but that could change by the time that they get there. If Iowa State, I'm sorry, I forgot about Baylor. The Iowa State, they're at 23, so if they lose for some reason, boom, they can get knocked out of the rankings. That means Baylor is their only ranked opponent left. I see Oklahoma going undefeated, and then at that point, just putting their resume into the hands of the committee. Alabama, LSU, that's going to be a big one because I think that the SEC race, there's going to be 2 conferences that decide the college football playoff in my mind this year. One's going to be the Big Ten, like I said, because if Wisconsin can beat in Ohio State this week, or if Wisconsin or Minnesota or anybody can beat a Ohio State or even a Penn State this season or in the Big Ten title game, that'll obviously shake things up, especially the Big Ten title game one, because that loss is coming so late in the year. It's coming right before that committee makes their final vote, to where I feel like the other one is the SEC, where if you look at the standings of the SEC right now, I think it's literally the polar same. I wanted to say, like, is that even a thing? Polar same? Kind of like polar opposites? It's like the identical same. It's identical, I should say, to the Big Ten. Words this late at night while I'm recording this. Kind of hard to say. Because you got 2 top caliber teams rated higher than Ohio State and Penn State. But in the West for the SEC, you got Alabama, LSU 1-2. On the other side, Florida's got a loss. Georgia's got a loss. Missouri, they're the third best team? They've already got a loss. Those teams might not be sniffing the playoffs. So, I mean, what I think will happen, and this is my mindset of it, if I want to go team by team really quick to give you a synopsis of how I feel at this point after this past week of college football, if I look at Alabama, really it comes down to me. Could Auburn beat Alabama? Yes. Yeah, it's in Alabama. It's in or at Auburn this year. Iron Bowl's usually a tough one. Coin toss it because of that rivalry is so fierce. I'm going to say that the only loss I could see Alabama taking is LSU, because there's a possibility that Tua doesn't play in that LSU game. And if Tua doesn't play in that LSU game, I'm siding with the Tigers 110%. Like, if Tua's not playing against Joe Burrow, I expect Joe Burrow to have a really good game. Maybe not 5-4 touchdown good, but 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, beats the Crimson Tide without Tua on the field. And obviously whoever loses that game, in my mind, is sitting at home, not playing in the SEC title game. LSU, I look at it, they've got Auburn this weekend, but it's at home, so I'll favor the LSU Tigers at home this week against Auburn. However, that one could be a sneaky upset special. Really, for them, it's the same thing. It comes down to that Alabama game, and whoever wins that game is playing for the SEC title. And I think whoever plays in that SEC title, even if it's against Florida, if it's against a Georgia, I think they win that game. However, there's a possibility whoever loses that game could benefit more than the winner if that winner loses to, let's say they play Georgia and they lose to Georgia. That is going to spiral, especially if it's a one-loss Georgia team and they're knocking on the door. That's going to create chaos, but I wouldn't be surprised if Alabama and LSU both made the playoffs, especially if one was the SEC crown, the other one, the only loss, was to the number one team in the nation, because let's be honest, if LSU wins out, they're going to be number one. If Alabama wins out, they're going to be number one as well. Then you look at Clemson, like, they're a team I know. I've talked to people, and they've said, well, there's a chance that an undefeated Clemson team doesn't make the playoffs. And the thing I think you got to look at with Clemson is, in my mind at the end, who's got a tougher schedule? Because if I had to predict the playoff right now, I would say LSU number one, just because I think LSU is going to win that Alabama game, because I don't think Tua is going to play right now. If Tua plays, ask me the week before, it may change to Alabama. But at this moment, I'm going to say LSU. They'll be number one. Then number two, I'm going to say Ohio State. I think they win out. I think they win the Big Ten. They'll be the number 2 team in the nation at the end of it. Number 3, I'm going to put Clemson / Oklahoma. I'll get to that in a hot second. Then number 4, I'd put Alabama then, because if Alabama's only loss is to LSU, that's really close to being perfect, and really you lost to the best team in the nation. So I would do what we saw a couple years ago and have LSU at 1, Alabama at 4. That would mean 5 would be Clemson / Oklahoma. I'll get to that in a second, because whoever's not 3 is going to be 5. And then 6 would probably be like a if Notre Dame wins out, it could be like a Notre Dame. It could be I don't think it's an SEC team, because they would have 2 losses. It'll probably be like let me look at the rankings really quick. Like a Notre Dame, or even like a Penn State. So like a Notre Dame or a Penn State, somebody who didn't play in that title game. Notre Dame doesn't have one. That's a 1-loss team on their side, because Penn State, I think, could be in the same situation that Alabama could be in, like 1 loss. They lost to Ohio State, and that could be even an argument and why people might push again for an 18 playoff, because Penn State will have only 1 loss and they're getting knocked out, and people say, well, it should be Alabama because LSU is ranked higher than Ohio State. I'm just trying to predict storylines at this point. The last thing of this, that Clemson, Oklahoma discussion of that 3rd spot, 3rd and 5th, I think that's going to be the main debate of the playoff teams. LSU, Alabama will be in 1-4. Ohio State undefeated is at 2. The question is, who's got the better resume for number 3. An undefeated Clemson team who, let's be completely honest, the ACC has not been a tough schedule this year, and especially the rest of the way for Clemson. They've got Boston College. They've got Wofford. Wofford? Is it Wofford? Wofford. The Terriers. NC State, who hasn't been anything this year. 25 Wake Forest, who they might not even be 25 when that game happens. And then South Carolina, who, let's be honest, the way they played Georgia and the way they played Florida, I wouldn't be surprised if that was an upset in South Carolina, to where I almost feel like Oklahoma would get in above Clemson, and boy, would that be a discussion. Would that be kind of ground shaking in college football if an undefeated Oklahoma got into the playoff over an undefeated Clemson? And then it comes into the debate also is, I know I'm putting Clemson against Oklahoma, and I'm going to pitch this to you guys for the question. Let's say it maps out like this. LSU's undefeated. Ohio State's undefeated. Clemson and Oklahoma, both undefeated. They win their conference championships. They don't have a single loss. If I'm putting LSU, Ohio State, Oklahoma for that 4th spot, if you choose Oklahoma over Clemson and Clemson gets bumped down, are you choosing undefeated Clemson or are you choosing one-loss Alabama? Because I'm going with schedule. I'm going that Alabama played more tougher teams. They would have had a tough team in Auburn, who, if they lose to LSU, might fall a little bit from 9, but it'll still be a ranked team and a really good team. And they would have played number 2 LSU, who would have ended up number 1 in this scenario. They have a common opponent of Texas A&M. This is Clemson and Alabama. And, of course, besides that, those are really the only big 3 tough games for Alabama. I would pick Alabama in that situation, even with 1 loss. But what would you think? Would you put Clemson in at number 4? Because they're undefeated. Alabama is not undefeated. And also, Clemson would be a conference champion. Alabama would not. And Clemson would kind of be facing almost the same fate that Ohio State faced the last time this happened, where Alabama was a one-loss team that made the 4th seed. So one last time, my prediction at this point of how things are going to play out with the Wisconsin loss: LSU is going to be number 1. Ohio State will be 2, both of them undefeated. An undefeated Oklahoma team at 3, a 1-loss Alabama team at 4, an undefeated Clemson team at 5, and then at 6, I'll put Penn State. Penn State, Notre Dame, whichever one you think. I'll lean Penn State, but if you want to put Notre Dame there, if they win out, I could see them being a prime candidate to be that 6th team in the nation. But obviously, this is where you guys come in. Let me know what you guys are thinking. How does this affect in your mind, how do you see the rest of the Big Ten playing out because of this upset loss that Illinois had over Wisconsin? And how do you think the college football playoff now is going to shake out because of this loss? Let me know what you guys are thinking, obviously, down below in that comment section.